Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text. So picture this for a second. It's 1924, right in the middle of Prohibition.
Oh, wow, okay. Going back a bit.
Yeah, going way back. A patient walks into a clinic, and the clinician writes them a prescription for, medicinal liquor.
Right, which was actually a real thing.
It was. And if you look at an original prescription stub from that era, you see, the patient's name, the date, the specific ailment, the exact quantity of alcohol to dispense, and the prescriber's signature.
It's a super fascinating historical artifact, for sure. But what's truly remarkable to me is the legal architecture of that piece of paper.
What do you mean?
Well, the mandatory elements required to generate a legally binding prescription, they've barely changed in over a century. The core logic of how we authorize a treatment has somehow survived 100 years of radical medical advancement.
And honestly, that enduring logic is exactly what we're exploring in this deep dive. So if you're an advanced practice nursing or a physician assistant student listening right now, you are in the middle of a massive professional transition.
Oh, absolutely massive.
Right. Today, our goal is mastering the principles in Chapter 2 of Len's Pharmacotherapeutics Rational Drug Selection and Prescription Writing. We're looking at what it takes to transition from the role of executing medical orders to, actually generating them.
Yeah, and it's really helpful to think of this transition in terms of, construction.
Okay, construction. I like that.
Yeah, so when you're a registered nurse or an allied health professional, you're the builder. Your role is incredibly complex and obviously essential, but you are ultimately executing a blueprint that was handed to you.
Right, the orders are already written.
Exactly. But as a prescriber, you become the architect. Suddenly, the entire structural integrity of that patient's care plan, the calculations, the load-bearing elements, that is entirely in your hands now.
Which is, it's an immense privilege, but also an equally heavy burden.
Completely. Because the safety of the patient rests entirely on your signature or, your digital credential these days.
Yeah, and that burden comes with some really rigid, non-negotiable ground rules from the text. For instance, the absolute prohibition against prescribing for your family, your friends, or yourself.
Right, the golden rule. You must have a formally documented provider-patient relationship. And the reason for this is that clinical safety demands absolute objectivity.
Because if it's someone you love,
your clinical judgment is inherently compromised. You might minimize a red flag symptom in your spouse because subconsciously you just don't want it to be serious. Or you might skip a critical diagnostic step. Which
ties directly into the next foundational rules.
Yeah.
Every single prescription has to be backed by a thorough, documented history and physical examination.
Always.
And you must have a documented plan for monitoring the drug's effects. You don't just hand over a script and wave goodbye. You're initiating a managed therapeutic relationship.
And, managing that relationship means confronting some very immediate non-pharmacological realities, way before we ever consider cellular mechanisms or receptor affinities.
Right, like the real-world roadblocks to care. Because before we ask how a drug works, we have to ask if the patient can actually get it.
Exactly. You could select the absolute perfect pathophysiological match for a condition, but if they get to the pharmacy counter and the copay is $400,
adherence just instantly drops to zero.
It drops to zero. Financial toxicity is a primary driver of non-adherence. And clinicians frequently overlook it because we get so hyper-focused on the clinical diagnosis.
So what's the fix?
You cannot wait for the patient to bring up their financial struggles. You have to integrate it into your clinical workflow. You just ask them directly, are you having difficulty obtaining your medications because of the cost?
Because if the answer is yes, that changes the entire trajectory of your drug selection.
Yeah.
You need to know the $4 generic lists at major pharmacies.
Right. And you need to understand how the Affordable Care Act mandates prescription coverage, but also recognize that the tiers and deductibles within those plans vary wildly. Finding a drug they can afford is just as critical as finding a drug that works.
Okay, so let's say we're looking for the right clinical choice, and we naturally turn to the published guidelines. We have these massive organizations, the AHA, ACC, IDSA, ADA. They publish these robust evidence-based algorithms.
They do, and they're incredibly valuable.
But I want to push back on this for a second.
Yeah.
If the American College of Cardiology issues a guideline, they have teams of leading experts and statisticians behind it. Why would a newly minted prescriber ever take the risk of deviating from that standard? Shouldn't we just follow the algorithm blindly?
Well, it's a valid concern, but relying blindly on an algorithm ignores the fundamental reality of clinical practice, which is that guidelines are designed for populations.
Ah, right. But you're treating an individual.
Exactly. The AHA algorithm assumes a relatively standard physiological presentation. It doesn't know that your specific patient has a rare comorbidity or a complex psychiatric history, or, like we just said, a specific financial barrier.
So the expectation is that we actually will need to deviate sometimes.
Yes. You use the guideline as your solid foundation, but patient-centered care demands individualization. If a patient doesn't fit the guideline, you adapt. But, and this is key, your legal and clinical protection here is documentation.
If it isn't documented, it didn't happen.
Right. If you deviate from the standard of care, you must clearly document your rationale in the chart. Explain the exact clinical reasoning for why the guideline was inappropriate for this specific individual.
Which protects the patient's continuity of care, and it protects your license. And speaking of frameworks that force us to adapt, we have to talk about formularies.
Oh, formularies, a massive part of modern prescribing.
Yeah, because you might have the perfect guideline-approved drug in mind, but the facility or the insurer just says no. Formularies are basically lists of approved drugs managed by hospitals, pharmacies, and agencies like CMS.
Right, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And these panels select drugs based on clinical efficacy, sure, but also regional supply chains, generic availability, and frankly, heavily negotiated cost rebates.
Which leads to those super frustrating scenarios. Like, say I diagnose a patient with erosive esophagitis. My clinical judgment points to omeprazole. I write the script, but the pharmacy kicks it back because the patient's formulary only covers esomeprazole.
And this is exactly where your pharmacological knowledge keeps you agile. The underlying mechanism of action between omeprazole and esomeprazole is functionally identical.
They're both proton pump inhibitors shutting down gastric acid secretion.
Exactly. The difference is purely bureaucratic availability. Knowing your first choice might be blocked means you just need to have a secondary option from the same drug class ready to go.
Okay, so we've navigated the insurance tiers, the guidelines, the formularies. We've found an accessible medication. Now we have to filter that selection through the patient's specific, unique physiology.
This brings us to patient-specific safeguards. And we have to start with the immense risks of drug interactions, because the most common trap for a new prescriber isn't like a complex interaction between two obscure prescription drugs.
No, what is it?
It's the invisible polypharmacy happening over the counter.
Oh, right, because patients simply do not categorize their morning vitamins or their herbal teas as medications.
Never. If you ask a patient to list their meds, they'll give you their statin and their blood pressure pill, but they will completely omit the St. John's wort or the daily high-dose ibuprofen they take for arthritis.
And that omission is dangerous because of how the body processes these compounds, right?
Completely. Many OTCs and botanical supplements utilize the exact same CYP450 enzyme pathways in the liver as prescription drugs.
Wait, give me an example of that.
So, St. John's wort is a potent inducer of the CYP3A4 enzyme. If your patient is taking it alongside an oral contraceptive, the liver metabolizes the contraceptive so quickly that it never reaches therapeutic levels.
Oh, wow, resulting in an unintended pregnancy.
Exactly. You must explicitly ask about OTCs and herbals.
That's a huge trap. Okay, let's look at another crucial distinction when filtering our drug choice, the difference between a side effect and a true allergy. Patients mix these up all the time.
They conflate them constantly. But clinically, they demand entirely different responses because they are completely different physiological mechanisms. A side effect is an expected, often dose-dependent reaction.
Like if you prescribe a new antihypertensive, the drug achieves the therapeutic goal, the blood pressure comes down nicely, but the patient develops orthostatic hypotension.
Right, they get dizzy and faint when they stand up.
So we have a serious side effect. We're treating the hypertension, but we've introduced a major fall risk. How do we handle that?
Here you apply a risk-to-benefit ratio. The benefit of normalized blood pressure does not outweigh the risk of a traumatic head injury from fainting. So, you manage the side effect by either lowering the dose or switching to a different class of antihypertensive.
But if a patient says they have an allergy, we're dealing with the immune system.
Precisely. A true allergy is an IgE-mediated immune response. If a patient reports anaphylaxis, airway compromise, profound facial swelling, that drug class is an absolute contraindication. You never prescribe it again.
But the problem is, patients often label a mild intolerance, like nausea or vomiting, as an allergy in their chart.
Right, which restricts your options, so you have to interrogate the reaction, ask them exactly what happened. If it was just stomach upset, and that specific antibiotic is the absolute best choice to save their life from a severe infection, it could theoretically be used again, maybe with an antiemetic.
But if it's a true documented allergy, you pivot. Like if a patient has pyelonephritis, a severe kidney infection, and they have a verified anaphylactic allergy to penicillin.
You don't just try a different penicillin.
Right, or even a closely related cephalosporin. You completely change classes. You move to like a fluoroquinolone to eradicate the pathogen while respecting the immune response.
Exactly. And since you brought up a kidney infection, we have to look at how end organ function dictates our prescribing. When a patient has renal or hepatic impairment, their ability to metabolize and excrete drugs is compromised.
Yeah. If their glomerular filtration rate, their GFR, is reduced, the drug isn't clearing at a normal rate.
It builds up in the blood, which vastly increases the risk of toxic accumulation. This is why we use renal and hepatic dosing, which usually means lowering the standard dose or extending the time between doses.
Okay, question though. Is it always enough to just lower the dose for a patient with kidney disease? Like, what if they're in acute pain? Can we just prescribe a smaller dose of morphine?
That is where critical thinking really elevates your practice. Lowering the dose is standard, but if you understand pharmacokinetics, you know morphine is highly metabolized into active metabolites that are excreted by the kidneys.
Oh, so in a renally impaired patient, even a reduced dose could accumulate.
Exactly. It leads to metabolite accumulation, causing profound respiratory depression or neurotoxicity. So you shouldn't just adjust the dose. You should abandon morphine entirely for this patient.
And switch to what?
A much safer choice would be fentanyl. Its pharmacokinetic profile is different. It doesn't rely on the kidneys in the same way, and it doesn't have active metabolites that accumulate in renal failure. You get the pain control, but avoid the vulnerability of failing kidneys.
Okay, so we've selected the perfect safe medication. It matches their renal function, avoids CYP450 interactions, fits the formulary. But none of that matters if we write the script wrong and the pharmacist misinterprets it.
Or if the patient can't adhere to the follow-up, yeah.
Right. So how do we translate this clinical decision into a legal prescription without causing harm?
First, before writing anything, evaluate the drug's monitoring requirements. Certain meds have a very narrow therapeutic index, meaning the gap between an effective dose and a toxic dose is razor thin.
I always think of this like adopting a high-maintenance pet. You wouldn't get a border collie if you live in a tiny studio apartment and work 14 hours a day. The environment just can't support the requirements.
That is a highly accurate analogy. Drugs like warfarin, lithium, opioids, immunosuppressants like tacrolimus, they demand a highly supportive environment. Frequent, sometimes weekly blood draws to check levels or INR.
And if the patient lives 2 hours from the nearest lab or doesn't have a car?
Then you cannot safely prescribe a narrow therapeutic index drug, no matter how pathophysiologically perfect it is. If they miss their lab appointments, a slight elevation in lithium levels causes severe neurotoxicity. A spike in INR leads to a hemorrhagic stroke. You have to pick a lower maintenance alternative.
Okay, assuming the patient can do the monitoring, let's look at the actual anatomy of a flawless prescription. If you're looking at figure 2.1 in the text, what are the mandatory elements?
It falls into 3 precise categories. First, prescriber info. Your name, clinical address, phone number, NPI, and your DEA number for controlled substances.
Got it.
Second, patient info. Full name, date of birth, and their verified allergies written directly on the script. And third, medication specifics. The drug name, strength, dose, route, frequency, total quantity to dispense, and number of refills.
But the text mentions one more crucial element. The indication, writing out the specific reason they're taking it, like Atenol for hypertension.
Yes, including the indication is a vital safety net. So many meds have vast off-label uses. Atenolol is a beta blocker for blood pressure, but we also use it for angina, or even off-label for severe performance anxiety.
So if I write a script for Atenolol and the dose seems unusually low for hypertension, the pharmacist might flag it as an error.
Exactly. But if you include the indication, atenolol for performance anxiety, the pharmacist immediately understands your intent. It's a context clue that lets them cross-check your logic and prevent massive errors.
Which brings us to the actual delivery methods and dodging the dangers of historical shorthand. We have a whole table 2.1, of abbreviations you have to actively unlearn.
Because the clinical environment is fast-paced, handwriting gets rushed, and these abbreviations are actively dangerous. For example, never use the letter U or IU. You have to write out units or international units.
Right, because a hastily written U connects at the top and looks exactly like a 0.
Exactly. If you rate 10 U of insulin, it might be read as 100 of insulin. That's a fatal 10-fold overdose. Similarly, never use QD or QOD. They're Latin for daily and every other day, but they are notoriously easy to mix up. Just write daily or every other day.
We also need to talk about leading and trailing zeros.
This is a strict rule. Never use a trailing zero. For 1 milligram, write 1 milligram, not 1.0 milligram. If a tired nurse misses that tiny decimal point, they'll administer 10 milligram.
And rule flips for fractions. Always use a leading 0.
Correct. For half a milligram, write 0.5 milligram, never 0.5 milligram. Without that leading 0, it's incredibly easy to mistake it for 5 milligrams.
No trailing zeros. Always use leading zeros. What about MS or MSO4?
Avoid those and avoid the optical abbreviations OS, OD, AS, and AD. MS can mean morphine, sulfate, or magnesium sulfate, radically different drugs, and the eye and ear abbreviations are just too similar. Right out, left ear, or right eye.
Now, obviously, we're shifting heavily toward e-prescribing through electronic medical records or EMRs.
Supported by CMS meaningful use incentives, specifically to eliminate all those handwriting errors we just talked about. But e-prescribing has its own strict rules, especially for Schedule II drugs.
Highly regulated controlled substances, high abuse potential, like potent opioids or ADHD stimulants.
Because of diversion risk, you can't just click send on a Schedule II in the EMR.
Yeah.
You are legally required to use two-factor authentication, like Duo or Nexmo. You have to verify your identity on a secondary device at the exact moment the script transmits.
But what if you're in a rural clinic, the EMR goes down, and you need to get a Schedule II script to the pharmacy immediately? Can you just call it in?
No, general rule. Schedule II drugs cannot be prescribed or refilled over the telephone. The DEA only allows it in an absolute, strictly defined medical emergency where there's no alternative.
Okay.
And even then, you can only authorize a limited emergency supply, and you are mandated to deliver a physical written script to that exact pharmacy within 7 days.
That really highlights how tightly controlled they are. What about refill logic for non-controlled meds? How do you decide between 1 month of refills versus 12 months?
It comes down to physiological stability. Ask yourself, is this a brand new medication? Did I just change the dose? Did I add a drug that might interact? Are there minor side effects?
If yes to any of those, you need to see them again soon.
Exactly. You shorten the refill interval to 1 to 3 months. That intentionally forces the patient to return so you can reassess. But if they've been on the exact same dose of a thyroid med for 3 years and labs are perfect...
It's stable, so you can do 12 months.
Yep. But remember, Schedule II gets 0 refills. A new script must be generated every single time.
We have covered so much ground today. But let's look at the reality of a 15-minute patient encounter. You have a complex patient, multiple comorbidities, and you aren't entirely sure if a new antibiotic will interact with their immunosuppressant.
That is the moment you lean on your digital infrastructure from box 2.1 in the text. No prescriber memorizes every interaction. You're expected to use apps like Hippocrates, Lexicomp, Pepid, PDR, UpToDate.
Just pull them up right there in the exam room.
You do. But remember, these apps assist. They don't replace your judgment. An app tells you the standard dose for a 60-year-old, but it doesn't know your patient has severe dysphagia and can't swallow pills, or has a profound financial barrier.
The software doesn't know the human sitting in front of you.
Exactly, which is why your ultimate resource is collaboration. Build relationships with your local pharmacists. They are the authorities on pharmacokinetics and formularies. And get to know your infectious disease specialist for local resistance patterns.
It really takes a collaborative village to prescribe safely. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We're surrounding ourselves with incredible digital safety nets.
We really are.
EMRs autocorrect our dangerous abbreviations. Apps flag CYP 450 interactions instantly. But as AI gets more integrated, catching errors faster and faster, how do we ensure we don't become overly reliant on the machine? How do we keep our prescribing instincts sharp so we remain the architect of the patient's care and not just passive builders following an AI's blueprint?
I mean, that is the defining challenge for the next generation of prescribers. You have to know the underlying science so deeply that the technology remains a tool rather than a necessary crutch.
And that deep understanding is exactly what you are building right now by studying this material. To all the advanced practice nursing and PA students listening, we know the transition to prescribing is daunting, but you have the clinical frameworks to succeed.
You absolutely do.
Thank you so much for studying with us today. This is a warm sign-off from the Last Minute Lecture team, wishing you the absolute best of luck in your clinical practice.